Welcome once again to our study. It's been quite some time since we have discussed Revelation. We've concluded our last study, section 5, discussing symbolism. And on this sixth study, I'd like to delve a little deeper into the topic of symbolism, discussing primarily a method of interpretation called interpretive maximalism. Interpretive maximalism. Now, some have criticized this method as one that is prone to unbridled speculation. And what I want to discuss right now is if that criticism is legitimate or not. Now, what do I mean by interpretive maximalism? What I mean by that is that the Bible is more than a set of propositions or even isolated propositions. The Bible is a narrative that is very much connected, various narratives forming one greater narrative we call the sacred scriptures. And in this story, the way we interpret it, the hermeneutical lens we use, will determine our interpretation, our conclusion, how we understand Revelation. So that explains why there are so many different interpretations of the book. People use different hermeneutical spectacles to approach the text. Our presupposition is that the Bible is God-breathed, and that means that the Spirit did not waste his breath when he penned through the writers every inspired word. So the Bible is meant to be interpreted maximally. In other words, there is more content, there is more glory in the text than first meets the eye. There is a certain virtue in giving giving detailed attention to the images and to the language that the Bible uses. Now, David Chilton argues in his commentary, the one we've been using for our study, Days of Vengeance, he argues that evangelicals, even though they affirm that the Bible is God's revelation, in practice, they do not give weight to the language of the Bible as they should. And so they will usually focus on the events of the Bible, certain big figures in the Bible. At times they bring in their pietistic lenses to the text, which means usually individualizing narratives that are meant to be corporate primarily. And by individualizing it, they fail to consider the broader implications, applications, and the greater point that the writer is making. Others will fail to give attention to why the Spirit worded certain narratives in a particular way, why he chose to use certain words, certain symbols, certain patterns in this passage and not in others. In short, the opposite of the maximalist approach, which I'm advocating, is the minimalist approach. And the minimalist usually refers to himself as the literalist. He's a literalist when it comes to the biblical text. And so they will focus on a method called the grammatical historical interpretation, which is a long tradition of interpretation, a very noble one which would be foolish to despise, a necessary method. But I believe our interpretation, especially when it comes to the book of Revelation, should not be limited by it. Now, I'm currently working on a project in the book of Ruth. And at first glance, if you consider the few chapters in Ruth, it appears to be a very simple narrative. But the more you dig into the meaning of the names of each character, the places that are mentioned, the very clear theology of the land, the theology of gleaning in the field, as we see later on when Ruth meets Boaz. If you consider also the nature of Boaz, his relationship to Ruth, one is absolutely compelled to realize that Ruth is really a miniature gospel, a miniature picture of that entire gospel narrative that we see fleshed out from Genesis to Revelation. And so that is what I mean by the interpretive maximalist. That is for instance, that is an example of how the interpretive maximalist would approach a book like Ruth. He would consider the names, the details, the locations used, the narrative in general, and develop from that a theology that would give a greater glory to the text itself. Now, ultimately, there are concerns about interpretive maximalism. Of course, if it is unchecked, it can fall into some of the dangers, some of the same errors that we see in the early church fathers. But what I think with proper care, observing the history of interpretation, continual engagement with the text, which I advocate, relying on pastors to keep you in check. If you're a parishioner, relying on your pastor to keep you in check. Honoring the genre of each book, avoiding theological interpretations that contradict distinct historical creeds like the Apostles or Nicene, always comparing Scripture with Scripture, avoiding coming out with a particular hermeneutic that only buttresses your secondary convictions. So use your hermeneutics for your own purposes. And other tests could be given, obviously. All that to say is that just as the minimalist can fall short of the intended meaning of the text, the maximalist can go beyond the meaning of the text. And so he needs some level of accountability as he approaches the passage. So he doesn't fall into an isolated interpreter, not giving proper attention to the testimony of history. Now, how does interpretive maximalism apply then or relate to the book of Revelation, which we intend to eventually get into after this introduction? Revelation is a book of symbols. We discussed this in lesson 5. You can go back and listen to that study. The language of Revelation is not isolated language. Revelation is dependent on language already used by other authors in the Bible. So the foundation of Revelation is a foundation of symbols dependent on the foundation already established in earlier prophets, such as Isaiah, even before that, and also New Covenant writers, such as the epistles. So the Apostle John, we need to realize, does not do theology in isolation, and neither should we. John is not inventing new language. He's using language that has already been used. John is not inventing new symbols. He's depending on symbols that have already been used. And so John does theology together with the inspired community of biblical writers, thence bringing together this connection, this connectionalism that exists between each book of the sacred scriptures. Well, I hope this has been helpful to give you some sort of idea into this methodology of biblical interpretation. And I want you to keep these things in mind as we continue our introduction, as we eventually enter into the book itself. I hope this has been helpful, and the Lord be with you, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.